cards hit the velvet table with a soft snap that cut through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. Marcus Thornwell, three-time World Series champion, face of a dozen luxury watch campaigns, ego the size of Manhattan, leaned back in his chair with that signature smirk spreading across his tanned face. His diamond cufflinks caught the chandelier light as he pushed a single black chip forward. $1 million, he said, loud enough for the cameras circling the private room to catch it. Beat me in a single hand, sweetheart, and it's yours. Across from him, 22-year-old Emma Hayes sat perfectly still, her second-hand blazer looking almost gray under the harsh lights. Her mother's maid uniform was probably still damp on the hook in the service hallway 2 floors below. The room, all mahogany panels and crystal decanters, the kind of place where her mother had scrubbed toilets for 15 years, seemed to hold its breath. Marcus didn't know it yet, but he just made the worst bet of his life. The Obsidian Club wasn't just exclusive. It was a fortress of old money and new arrogance, perched on the 63rd floor of a steel and glass tower overlooking the Hudson River. Membership cost more than most people earned in 5 years. The carpet was so thick it swallowed footsteps. The air smelled of aged scotch and expensive cologne, with an undertone of something else: entitlement. Emma Hayes had grown up in the shadow of places like this. Her mother, Rosa, had cleaned these rooms since Emma was 7, polishing the brass fixtures, emptying ashtrays, scrubbing wine stains from imported rugs, while men in suits ignored her like she was furniture. Rosa never complained. She just worked, her hands growing rough and red, her back gradually curving under the weight of invisible burdens. Emma had watched it all, watched her mother slip out before dawn, return after dark. Watched her count pills for arthritis she couldn't afford to treat properly. Watched her smile anyway, always telling Emma, "You're going to college, mija. You're going to have choices I never had." Marcus Thornwell represented everything Emma had learned to recognize over those years. 43 years old, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, he'd turned poker into his personal theater, a stage where he could humiliate opponents and collect their money while cameras captured his calculated cruelty. He was famous for breaking amateur players, especially those who looked like they didn't belong. The poorer they were, the more he seemed to enjoy it. Tonight's charity event was typical Thornwell theater. Invite regular people for a chance to play against the champion, televise their inevitable humiliation, write it off as entertainment philanthropy. The crowd of wealthy spectators lined the walls, cocktails in hand, ready for the show. What none of them knew, what Marcus certainly didn't know, was that Emma Hayes had spent 4 years studying statistical mathematics at Columbia on a full scholarship, and she'd spent the last 2 years learning poker the hard way, in basement games and late-night online tournaments, turning a borrowed $100 into enough to help pay her mother's medical bills. She hadn't come here by chance. She'd earned her seat. The charity selection had been rigged from the start. Emma understood that now. Marcus's assistant had circulated through the crowd earlier, clipboard in hand, supposedly choosing random applicants. But Emma had noticed the pattern. Young women, poorly dressed, nervous. People who looked like they'd be easy to break on camera. When they'd called her name, the crowd had actually laughed. A few people near the bar turned to look at her thrift store blazer, her simple ponytail, her worn ballet flats. One woman in pearls had whispered to her companion, loud enough for Emma to hear, "Isn't that Rosa's daughter? The cleaning lady?" Marcus had been more direct. As Emma approached the table, he looked her up and down with theatrical slowness, then turned to his audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, our brave challenger tonight. Tell me, sweetheart, does your mom know you're up here? Shouldn't you be helping her empty the trash?" The room had erupted in laughter. Polite, champagne-lubricated laughter, but laughter nonetheless. Emma's face had burned, but she kept walking, kept her expression neutral. She dealt with worse. Then Marcus had spotted Rosa. Her mother had been passing through the far doorway, pushing her cleaning cart, trying to be invisible as always. Marcus had pointed, making sure the cameras followed. "There she is. Hey, Rosa, your daughter's about to lose her rent money to me. You might want to stick around for this." Rosa had frozen, her weathered hands gripping the cart handle. Her eyes met Emma's across the room, filled with worry, with love, with that terrible maternal instinct to protect. She'd looked so small in that moment, so tired. That's when something inside Emma had crystallized into pure, cold determination. Marcus settled into his chair, shuffling a pristine deck with practiced flourishes. Tell you what, I'm feeling generous tonight. One hand, Texas Hold'em, you win. I'll give you $1 million. His eyes glittered with cruel amusement. When you lose, you get on camera and tell everyone how you thought you could play with the big boys? Deal? Emma looked at her mother one more time, then back at Marcus. Deal. The dealer, a thin man with silver hair and steady hands, broke the seal on a new deck. The sound of cellophane tearing seemed unnaturally loud. Emma watched him shuffle with mechanical precision, the cards whispering against each other in a rhythm she'd memorized years ago. 7 rifles, 2 strips, 1 final riffle, standard casino protocol. Marcus was talking, of course. He always talked. It was part of his strategy. Dominate the space, control the narrative, make opponents doubt themselves before the first card fell. You know what I love about charity poker? He addressed the crowd like a talk show host, gestures broad and confident. It reminds people where they belong. No offense, Emma. Can I call you Emma? But there's a reason your mom cleans floors and I own buildings. He paused for effect. Genetics, work ethic, intelligence. Some people have it, some people don't. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd. Emma noticed some of the older money, the real wealth, the kind that didn't need to announce itself, had stopped smiling. A silver-haired woman near the window was watching Marcus with undisguised distaste, but most of the room was eating it up. Phones were out, recording. This would be on social media within minutes. Poker legend destroys cleaning lady's daughter. The narrative was already written. Emma's hands rested flat on the green velvet, perfectly still. She'd learned that in the basement games, never show nervousness, never fidget, never give anything away. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her breathing remained slow and controlled. The dealer slid 2 cards face down to each player. Emma lifted the corners just enough to see King of Hearts, King of Diamonds. A strong starting hand, but far from unbeatable. Her expression didn't change. Marcus glanced at his cards with the barest flicker of interest, then pushed a stack of chips forward. $50,000. Let's make this interesting, Emma called without hesitation. Her scholarship money had taught her about leverage and probability. More importantly, her late night studying game theory had taught her about pattern recognition. The dealer burned a card and spread the flop. King of clubs, 7 of spades, 2 of hearts. 3 of a kind. King's over. Emma's pulse jumped, but her face remained serene. She'd learned to control that reaction in a smoky basement in Queens, playing against men who'd been reading tells since before she was born. Marcus studied the board for exactly 3 seconds. Emma counted, then pushed another $100,000 forward. His fingers drummed once against the table, a tiny gesture. Most people wouldn't notice it, but Emma noticed everything now. She'd been watching Marcus for 2 hours before the game started, studying him through the crowd while he played exhibition hands, while he posed for photos, while he held court like a king in his castle. She'd seen that finger drum 3 times. Once when he bluffed a tourist out of $5,000. Once when he had nothing and wanted to appear confident. Once when he was explaining a hand he'd lost. It was his tell. Tiny, unconscious, but there. The drum meant uncertainty masked as confidence. Emma called again. The dealer burned and turned. 9 of diamonds. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The room had gone quieter now. Even the bartender had stopped pouring. Rosa stood frozen in the doorway, one hand pressed against her chest. You're in over your head, sweetheart. Marcus pushed forward another $200,000. His voice was steady, but something had shifted. The performance was still there, but underneath it, Emma detected the first whisper of doubt. Last chance to fold and save yourself the embarrassment. Emma looked at the pot, at the cards, at Marcus's face, still smirking, still confident, but with tension now creeping into the corners of his eyes. She looked at her mother, standing in the doorway in her cleaning uniform, and remembered every morning Rosa had left before sunrise, every night she'd returned after Emma was supposed to be asleep. Remembered the arthritis pills Rosa skipped to pay for Emma's textbooks. Remembered the quiet dignity with which her mother had endured 1,000 small humiliations in rooms exactly like this one. Emma pushed all her chips forward, $350,000, everything she had. I call. The room seemed to contract. Someone gasped. Marcus's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. But Emma had noticed something else now, something that sent ice water through her veins and set her mind racing through probabilities and patterns. The way Marcus's eyes had flicked to the dealer after the 9 fell. The way his breathing had changed, shallower, faster. He didn't have the hand he was representing. She was almost certain now. The dealer reached for the deck to burn the final card. Everything depended on what came next. 3 years earlier, a basement in Queens that smelled of cigarette smoke and cheap beer. Emma had been 19, sitting at a folding table under flickering fluorescent lights, trying not to cry after losing her entire $200 stake, 2 weeks of tutoring money, to a man named Vincent Carraway who looked like someone's grandfather and played like a machine. She gathered her coat, ready to leave and never come back, when Vincent had called out, "Kid, sit down a minute." He'd been 73 years old, a retired mathematics professor who'd turned to poker after his wife died. The other players said he'd once been somebody important, before grief and whiskey had brought him to basement games in Queens. "You play like you're trying not to lose," he'd told her, sliding her $200 back across the table. "That's different than playing to win. You know why you lost tonight?" Emma had shaken her head, shame burning in her throat. "Because you were so busy watching your own cards, you forgot to watch the people holding them." Vincent had tapped his temple. "Poker isn't about the cards, kid. It's about patterns, human patterns. People are creatures of habit. They can't help it. They tell you everything if you know how to listen." Over the next 2 years, Vincent had become her unlikely mentor. He taught her to read micro-expressions, breathing patterns, the tiny physical tells that even professionals couldn't fully control. But more than that, he taught her something deeper. "The most dangerous moment in poker," he'd said one night, a month before his heart attack took him, "is when your opponent thinks they've already won. That's when they get sloppy. That's when their ego does your work for you." He'd fixed her with those sharp, faded blue eyes. "The rich ones are the worst. They've spent their whole lives winning, so they stop seeing the game clearly. They see what they expect to see. A poor girl who doesn't belong, a cleaning lady's daughter who got lucky. They don't see you." He'd placed a wrinkled hand over hers. "Emma, listen to me. Your poverty isn't your weakness. It's your camouflage. They'll underestimate you every single time. And the moment they do, you take everything." Back at the Obsidian Club, the dealer's hand hovered over the deck. Emma felt Vincent's words settle into her bones like an old prayer. Marcus thought he'd already won. His body language screamed it. The relaxed shoulders, the theatrical gestures, the way he'd already started turning toward the cameras for his victory speech. He wasn't watching the game anymore. He was performing his triumph, and that was going to cost him everything. The dealer's fingers touched the top card, the burn card. Everything in the room seemed to move in slow motion, the ice melting in forgotten drinks, the subtle shift of weight as spectators leaned forward, the nearly imperceptible rise and fall of Rosa's shoulders as she held her breath in the doorway. Marcus had already started his victory lap. He gestured to the cameras with one hand, his politician's smile firmly in place. "You know, I almost feel bad," he was saying, his voice carrying that practiced tone of false humility. "The kid's got guts, I'll give her that. Coming up here, putting it all on the line. That takes courage." He paused, milking the moment. Misguided courage, but courage nonetheless. A few people laughed. Someone near the bar called out, "Show us what you've got, Marcus." Emma watched him, really watched him. His left hand rested on the table, fingers splayed, steady, confident. But his right hand, hidden below the table's edge, she could see his knee bouncing, just slightly. A micro tremor running through his body that his upper half tried to deny. Vincent's voice echoed in her mind. "They tell you everything." The dealer burned the card and revealed the river. 2 of diamonds. The board now read, King of clubs, 7 of spades, 2 of hearts, 9 of diamonds, 2 of diamonds. Emma's three kings had just become a full house. Kings over twos. It was a monster hand, nearly unbeatable, but her expression remained perfectly neutral, a mask of uncertainty she'd practiced in 1,000 basement games. Marcus stared at the board for 5 full seconds. Emma counted them, watching the calculations run behind his eyes. Then his face broke into a genuine smile. Not the camera smile, but something raw, more predatory. "All in," he said, pushing his remaining chips forward. Nearly $3 million, everything he'd brought to the table tonight. The crowd gasped. Someone dropped a glass, and it shattered against the marble floor with a sound like breaking ice. "Jesus, Marcus," someone muttered. "You're really going to take everything from her?" "Business is business," Marcus said. But he was looking at Emma now with something approaching respect. Or maybe it was just the thrill of the kill. "What's it going to be, sweetheart? You can fold right now, walk away with what you came with, or you can call, and I'll own every penny you have." He leaned forward. "And then your mom can clean up this mess, like always." The room had gone completely silent. No ice clinking, no whispered commentary. Even the bartender stood frozen, a bottle suspended in mid-pour. Emma looked down at her cards one more time, though she'd memorized them the moment they'd been dealt. King, full house. The math was simple. She was almost certainly ahead. There were only a handful of hands that could beat her. Pocket sevens for quad sevens, pocket twos for quad twos, 7-9 for a higher full house. But Emma wasn't thinking about the math anymore. She was thinking about patterns. She was thinking about the way Marcus's breathing had changed when the river fell. Faster, shallower, like a man trying to control excitement. The way his pupils had dilated slightly. A physiological response he couldn't fake. The way his knee had stopped bouncing the moment he'd said all in. He thought he had her beat. He was certain of it, which meant one of two things. Either he had one of those miracle hands, or he was about to pull off the bluff of his career on national television, humiliating a cleaning lady's daughter with pure theatrical audacity. Emma's hands moved to her chips. The crowd leaned in as one organism, 100 people breathing in sync. Rosa's hand had moved to her mouth, her eyes wide and glistening. Emma looked at Marcus one last time, saw the triumph already playing behind his eyes, saw the story he was already telling himself about this moment, about the girl who dared to challenge a champion. She thought of Vincent, of his wrinkled hands and sharp eyes, of her mother's bent back and red knuckles, of every person who'd ever looked through her like she was invisible. Emma pushed her chips forward. "I call." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Marcus's smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind his eyes, something quick and uncertain, there and gone in less than a heartbeat. The dealer looked at Marcus. "Sir, please show your cards." This was the moment. The room held its breath. The cameras zoomed in. Time seemed to suspend itself, balanced on the knife's edge between triumph and devastation. Marcus reached for his cards with fingers that were, for the first time all night, not quite steady. Marcus flipped his cards with a flourish that was just a fraction too theatrical. 9 of spades, 9 of hearts. Full house. 9s over 2s. The crowd erupted. Someone screamed. Phones shot up, capturing the moment from a dozen angles. Marcus was already rising from his chair, arms spreading wide in victory, his face splitting into that famous television smile. "Sorry, sweetheart," he said, reaching across the table as if to console her. "You played well, but wait." Emma's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Quiet, but somehow it silenced the entire room. She hadn't moved, hadn't stood, hadn't shown even a flicker of defeat. Slowly, deliberately, she turned over her cards. King of hearts, king of diamonds. The dealer's voice was professional, almost clinical. "Full house, kings over 2s. Player 2 wins." For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The words seemed to hang in the air, incomprehensible, as if spoken in a foreign language. Then Marcus's face changed. The transformation was almost beautiful in its completeness. Confusion melting into comprehension, comprehension hardening into disbelief, disbelief cracking into something that looked almost like fear. "No," he said. Just that. No. Emma stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. You were so sure you had the winning hand. You stopped paying attention to what I might be holding. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. You saw what you expected to see, a scared girl in over her head. You didn't see the math. She gestured to the board, to the chips, to the cameras that were now capturing something very different than what they'd expected. 3 kings beats 3 nines, Mr. Thornwell. Basic poker. Marcus's mouth opened and closed. His face had gone from tan to pale to flushed in the span of seconds. You got lucky. That's all. Beginner's luck. No. Emma's voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. I counted the outs. I read your tells. I calculated the odds of you having pocket nines versus trying to bluff me off a better hand. I played the probabilities, and I played you. She paused, letting it sink in. You lost the moment you decided I wasn't worth taking seriously. The dealer was already stacking chips, the sound of plastic on plastic filling the shocked silence. $4,200,000 to player 2. Rosa had both hands pressed to her face now, tears streaming down her cheeks. Marcus stared at the chips as if they were a hallucination. His mouth worked soundlessly. Then finally the words came out in a hoarse whisper that the microphones barely caught. How? Emma looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity, wasn't quite triumph, something colder and more final than either. You spent the whole night telling me I didn't belong here. You were right. She gathered her coat, her composure absolute. I belong somewhere better. She walked toward her mother. The crowd parted like water, silent, stunned. Behind her, Marcus Thornwell sat frozen at the table, alone with his empty chips and his cameras and the wreckage of his carefully constructed image. The great champion, beaten by a cleaning lady's daughter. The sound of Emma's footsteps on marble was the only sound in the room. Emma reached her mother in the doorway. Rosa pulled her close, trembling, whispering prayers in Spanish that Emma had heard all her life, prayers of gratitude, of protection, of impossible hope, finally answered. Mija, Rosa breathed. Mija, what did you do? I won, Mama. Emma held her mother's work-roughened hands. We won. Behind them, the room began to stir. The silver-haired woman near the window started clapping. Slow, deliberate applause that rang out like a bell. Others joined, hesitantly at first, then with growing conviction. Not everyone. Some of Marcus's circle had already slipped toward the exits, their phones dark, suddenly unwilling to be associated with what had just happened. But enough people were clapping, enough to matter. The club's manager appeared, pale and sweating, holding a leather portfolio. Miss Hayes, if you'll come with me, we'll need to arrange the transfer. His eyes kept darting to Marcus, who still sat motionless at the table, staring at nothing. Emma glanced back one final time. Marcus looked smaller somehow, diminished. The cameras were still rolling, but now they captured something else. A man whose cruelty had finally found its limit, whose arrogance had built the stage for his own humiliation. She felt no joy in his collapse, just a quiet sense of balance, like a scale finally settling into equilibrium. Mr. Thornwell, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room one last time. Thank you for the game, and thank you for reminding me why I play. She paused. It was never about the money. It was about proving that people like my mother, people you look through like they're invisible, we see everything. And we remember. Marcus didn't respond, didn't look up. The king had been checkmated, and there were no words left. Emma turned back to her mother, slipping an arm around Rosa's shoulders. Come on, Mama, let's go home. But my shift, I need to finish. No. Emma's voice was firm but gentle. You're done cleaning other people's messes. Starting tonight, everything changes. They walked toward the elevator together, mother and daughter, past marble columns and crystal chandeliers, past people who would finally remember their faces. Behind them, in the wreckage of his certainty, Marcus Thornwell sat alone at the table where he'd built his legend. The chips were gone. The crowd was dispersing. The cameras captured every second of his silence. Tomorrow the story would be everywhere. But it wouldn't be the story he'd planned to tell. 2 weeks later, Rosa Hayes turned in her resignation at the Obsidian Club. Her daughter stood beside her as she handed the letter to the same manager who'd watched her push cleaning carts through those halls for 15 years. He looked uncomfortable, shuffling papers he didn't need to shuffle. "Rosa, we appreciate your service." "I know," Rosa said simply. There was no bitterness in her voice, no triumph, just quiet dignity. "Thank you for the opportunity." Outside, the November air was crisp and clean. Emma had already enrolled her mother in physical therapy for her arthritis, had paid off the mortgage on their small house in Queens, had set up a trust that would ensure Rosa never had to choose between medicine and groceries again. The rest of the money, most of it, Emma put toward a foundation. Scholarships for kids like her. Kids whose parents cleaned buildings they'd never own, who understood hunger not as an abstraction, but as a weeknight reality. Marcus Thornwell had disappeared from television. The endorsement deals had evaporated. His legend, it turned out, couldn't survive the video of him being outplayed by a 22-year-old in a secondhand blazer. Emma didn't watch those videos. Didn't need to. She was already building something better than revenge. She was building opportunity. On their way to the subway, Rosa stopped, turning to look back at the tower of steel and glass one final time. "Do you think he learned anything?" she asked. Emma considered this, watching clouds drift past the building's reflective surface. She thought about Vincent, about pattern recognition, about the way people reveal themselves in moments of certainty. "Maybe," she said finally, "but it doesn't matter. We weren't there to teach him, Mama." Rosa smiled, understanding. They walked on together through the city that had asked so much of them and was finally, slowly, beginning to give something back. Behind them, the Obsidian Club's windows glittered in the fading afternoon light. Still expensive, still exclusive, still convinced of its own importance. But inside one of those rooms, a table sat empty, cards scattered, chips gone, a throne abandoned. Because in the end, Marcus Thornwell had been right about one thing. Some people do know where they belong. He just never understood that Emma Hayes belonged exactly where she'd proven herself to be, on the other side of his arrogance, holding all the cards he'd been too blind to see her play. He thought he was gambling with money. She was playing for something he'd never understood, the worth of people he'd spent a lifetime looking through. And that bet? She'd won it long before the cards were ever dealt. So that's Emma's story, a reminder that the people we overlook often see us more clearly than we see ourselves. What moment hit you hardest? Was it when Marcus mocked Rosa? When Emma revealed her kings? Or that final walk to the elevator, mother and daughter, finally free? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in stories where intelligence defeats arrogance, where dignity outlasts cruelty, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told. Stories of underdogs who refuse to stay down, of justice that arrives quietly but completely. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.